So welcome everyone. We've also got tonight, we've got quite a few PCC members and also some non-PCC members. So welcome especially to those of you who've decided to give us a try tonight. We are recording the meeting. So the meeting afterwards will be shared once Brian's done his wizardry to be able to review. And this is definitely the sort of meeting that you might want to go back, have a look at again, and then do some cross references against the Bob Hall book if you've got that, or do some learning. So thank you everyone for joining, and also welcome to the first Spotlight series, is what we're calling these, of 2025. And so tonight's meeting is about Bacchus Paperweights, and has been prompted by the weight that sold recently that fetched quite a high price and is attributed to Bacchus. That popped up on one of the Facebook sites. And so after that, Alan and I got together and we thought it'd be quite useful to try and put something together as quickly as we can. So this may not be as polished as if we had lots more time, but we thought it was probably a really timely opportunity to get together. So I'm co-hosting tonight with Alan. Obviously, many of you will know Alan via his significant contribution to the paperweight community, via the research, his articles, talks, and also, relevant to tonight, his old English paperweight interest has stemmed from 25 years ago. And so we're really fortunate that Alan's studying of these groups of paperweights is able to help to inform our conversation tonight, as well as researching all the connections between all the different weights which are out there. So yeah, thank you for Alan for joining us and sharing your knowledge. My own interest in Bacchus Paperweights stemmed from 2021, when I was fortunate to not only get one Bacchus paperweight, but be successful with two. And so really that's what stems my love of Bacchus, but also my interest as to my project to try to document all the Bacchus paperweights out there, to try to help fellow collectors who, like I was back then, going, did the Canes match, is it? And then also taking that punt in the auction as to how high to go based on what knowledge I've got available to me. So I'm a year into my Bacchus catalogue raisonné project. So that's who I am. So when we talk about Bacchus paperweights, it's probably worth pointing out at the start that there is no hard evidence that this group of weights that we refer to as Bacchus were actually made by them. So what we have is a group of weights which are of extremely high quality, and we're going to see quite a few of them tonight, and they're all from the same factory. And so what we can see is we've got crossover canes and lots of different, I suppose, similarities between them really, but it is the quality and the beauty of them that stand out and make them sort of head and shoulders against some of the other old English weights. So in terms of the history of Bacchus paperweights, Evangeline Bergstrom was the person who we know had the first Bacchus paperweight in a book that was 1940. However, in that book, it was listed as Stourbridge. So if any of you have got that, there's two weights in there. One of them's a Bacchus, so do take a look at that. And then in 1949, Barrington Haynes, he published his book. And so this is now 100 years after Bacchus paperweights were made. And in this book, he attributes the paperweights as being by Bacchus. However, what he didn't do was leave any explanation or any clues as to why he so called them Bacchus paperweights. So despite Alan's extensive research, we can't find that sort of link to them. So what then happens is Hollister, he wrote a chapter about Bacchus paperweights. Some of you may well know that from his book, which I believe was about 1969. And that posed the question as to how many are out there, and then also gave some sort of hints as to their identification, some of the styles of the canes. But it wasn't really until 1998 when Bob Hall produced the Old English book, which had the sort of largest resource of Bacchus paperweights to date collated in one place. However, there are some identification problems with them, which hopefully with the help of Alan and you all tonight, we're going to be able to review some of these and then present them to you. So how it's going to work tonight, the first part of the talk, Alan's going to be giving some general introduction onto Bacchus paperweights, and then also just focus a bit on Bob Hall and his interactions with Bob and what he learned from him. I'm then going to be able to confirm which of the Bacchus paperweights are those which are in the book. And then Alan is going to share his thoughts on some of those remaining ones. So this presentation, though, is probably worth noting is, I suppose, shares the views of myself and Alan. And so it's not necessarily, everyone's views. It's just giving an idea of the research that we've done and then coming to some conclusions. So it's just with that caveat to make you aware it's with the best possible information that we have available. And what we're going to do is we're going to put you on mute, if that's okay, whilst we deliver the sort of presentation parts. But after each section, we're going to take a pause. And so therefore, if anyone has any questions, if you can come off mute and store them off at that point, rather than sort of come in during the sort of particular sections, if that's okay. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand over, and it's amazing. Thank you so much for giving up your time, Alan, and hand over to Alan to introduce his first section of the talk. So Alan's doing the screen sharing on his. So over to you, Alan, as and when you're ready.
Yes, let me just start the slideshow.
Oh, sorry, just to let you know, whilst Alan's doing that, sorry, I thought Brian was able to mute everybody. So if you know how to find the mute button on your iPad, your laptop, or your phone, if you can just check that you are on mute, please. Brilliant. Okay. Over to you, Alan.
Okay, I should be sharing a screen now.
Yeah, we can see the screen and just need to put it in the slideshow, Alan.
Yeah,
That's
should
it.
be
Perfect.
there. Okay, well, you've been told what this is. We're talking about Bacchus paperweights, and the classic Bacchus paperweight, they're large. Excuse me. They're always large. I think if you find a small one, that might be interested to know about it. The outer canes are all drawn under to form a basket. And generally, the outer canes are all smaller. And another thing to note, you don't see any clear glass. You don't look down. They're not spaced concentrics or garland patterns. They're filled with canes. And I think that makes sense because if you've got a basket there, you don't really want to be peering down to the canes of the basket. There are a variety of designs. Victoria's been doing some hard work and says 55% roughly are concentrics, 18% close packs, 10% sodden snow, and the balance are a variety of designs. We don't know exactly how many were made, but Victoria, I think you've got 350. Maybe that means there were 500 to 600 because there will be some people with collections we know nothing about. There will be some that have been thrown in the dustbin when a house has been cleared. But that's not many, 500, 600. And what they constitute is a minor product of a fairly modest sized factory. I mean, it wasn't tiny, it wasn't one of the biggest. They certainly were making these paperweights 1849, or at least Bacchus were making paperweights 1849. They may have started in 1848. We don't know how long they went on, but if it was just a couple of years, that is actually less than one paperweight a day for that period. So that really emphasizes that they were a minor product of the factory. Back then, they were not sold to the public, and they would have been made to order. Bacchus would have shown their paperweights at trade exhibitions. They might have had a little showroom in the factory. They'd have had some traveling salesmen. But they wouldn't have sold them singly, I don't think. If you look at catalogues of glass makers in Victorian times, they're priced by the dozen or gross. Things like this might even have been a half dozen, but they would have been made to order. And so if somebody put an order in for a dozen of them, it would take the makers a chair, a group of 4 people, which is how these factories worked, something like 3 hours to make a dozen of them if the setups were already done. And 3 hours was what was called a move in those days. They did 6-hour shifts consisting of 2 moves. And in a move, they were required to make a certain amount of product in order to get paid. Anything beyond that, extra work, was called overwork, and they got paid extra. But they would not have hung about. They'd have made these quite quickly. But chairs tended to specialise. One group might be the ones who normally made the jugs or the decanters or vases, candlesticks, whatever. And if they're making maybe a dozen every fortnight, a 3-hour shift, that is, every fortnight, it'd probably be the same chair. And that means the chair of 4 workers with the gaffer doing the complex, difficult bits. These might all have been made by the same gaffer over the course of a couple of years. Bob Hall, this is the thing I really want to try and introduce you to because it'll help understand his book. He was born in 43, died, I don't remember exactly when, died a few years ago. But he left school age 15, went to work in a car factory, became an engineering apprentice and a qualified engineer, and had various engineering jobs around the Birmingham area. And then in his late 20s, he set up his own business. And it was selling, distributing bottled gas, colour gas. And that meant he got out and about around the Birmingham, Stourbridge area and the West Midlands. But what he said to me one time was that he'd always gone round the markets and second-hand shops, even when he was an apprentice. He was looking for tools and equipment to say, here, underpriced or needed repair, and he could do them up, sell them on, and be profitable. But in the course of doing that, he saw paperweights occasionally. And he said the first one he bought was a Whitefriars one with controlled bubbles, because that intrigued him as to how on earth they'd made it with the bubbles in the sort of set spaces. But then he got interested in paperweights and started collecting the Millefiori. And we're talking here really of mid-1960s onwards. And he couldn't find much out about them, no books. He was told by some of the sellers they were old, they were made locally in the Birmingham, Stourbridge area, but that's about all he knew. And he kept collecting them, and he didn't pay a lot for them. But go forward now, 15 years, and Charles Heidermach is the, not established is wrong, it was Dudley Council probably established it, but he was the curator of the Broadfield House Glass Museum, and Bob got in touch and I think probably took some of his weights along, and he was told, yes, some of the local factories, Bacchus, Richardson, Islington, Walsh had made paperweights. And then this rather important point for Bob, collectors were paying quite a lot for Bacchus, and Bob was always after a way to make a bit of money. And the difficulty was he could find the paperweights, but where did he find the collectors? I think it was about 1982, he was told there was this group that met in Cambridge in the evening, organised by a glass dealer over there, Dennis Gould, which was the Cambridge Paperweight Circle, which met occasionally during the year. And so Bob went there, joined, and really that's where it all began for Bob in terms of paperweights, because he realised that, yes, you could buy and sell paperweights and make money. So he started doing that, not just old English paperweights, French paperweights, Isart, whatever, and started dealing, standing at fairs, went over to he had a sister in the States, and I think that suited him to go to a PCA convention, and met Larry Selman and supplied paperweights to Larry, particularly Old English, particularly Bacchus. He was, of course, on the CPC committee as was, and then he was the newsletter editor. I took over from him in 2006. He certainly saw there was an opportunity to write a book on Old English paperweights. And I think Larry Selman suggested he contact Schiffer Publishing, which he did, and arranged to write the book and publish it. He certainly drew on Anne Anderson's work, as well as what he'd done himself, and lots of other people he talked to, and museums and so forth, and produced what was at the time, I think, certainly the most comprehensive book on Old English paperweights. And I think in a way that still stands. What was a bit more challenging was discussing with him one or two times, to be honest, how he decided what was a Bacchus. And there was an element of, well, if it was a large, decent quality weight, it was Bacchus. If it had head silhouette canes in, the Queen's head silhouettes, he was convinced it was Bacchus. He had not really cottoned onto the fact that there were different head silhouettes from different molds. He then had this identification of what he called ruffle canes, rogue canes, 18 cog canes. All these indicated Bacchus to him. But if having an 18 cog cane as an indication of Bacchus, I think, is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you say that anything with an 18 cog cane in is a Bacchus, then only Bacchus have 18 cog canes. So I don't think that's a very fair criterion. And of course, there was this issue that if you called it Bacchus, it wasn't a 200-pound weight, it was probably a 1,000-pound weight back then. And you'll see in the book, and as we go through some of the stuff tonight, pieces that didn't really look like what you might call the classic Bacchus are called early Bacchus or later Bacchus or even unique Bacchus, which I think is struggling to shoehorn into the category pieces that maybe shouldn't be there. Now, these three, they are pieces I bought, 25 years ago, just about. And in each case, when I showed them to Bob, probably around 2002, 2003, I was told, oh, those are later or earlier Bacchus. Personally, I don't believe any of them are Bacchus. It was maybe 2003, 4. I was very interested in Old English paperweights and collected lots of them, measured the density of any I could get my hands on, which included a lot of Bob's. I mean, I knew Bob well, and he stayed with us at times and we stayed with him. And one time I was staying with him, I measured the density of quite a few of the ones he'd got. But I also wrote articles on the different head canes that had come from different molds. I wrote an article on William Gillinder, which completely contradicted what Paul Hollister said about him, and having gone to Birmingham age 8 and become a gaffer age 14 and so forth. I mean, that unfortunately was best described as nonsense. My resources were government records such as births, marriages, deaths, censuses and so forth. And all of these were in conflict with what Bob was saying in his book. And I did discuss with him whether there should be a second edition, because there are one or two just straightforward errors, the same paperweight shown on 2 or 3, on a couple of different pages with different descriptions. But there was additional information. There were a few weights in the Bacchus chapter I felt belonged in other groups because they matched some of the ones in his unknown chapter. And I think it was sort of after we'd been out for a meal and Bob sitting there with a whiskey in his hand and we're talking about this, and he said to me, I know some are not Bacchus. They had to go in the chapter because I sold them as Bacchus. Now, we didn't go into details as to which they were. I mean, it wasn't appropriate at the time, and I never really got the chance to either, because Bob was very ill late 2007. He was in viral meningitis. He was in an induced coma for over a week. And sadly, he just about lost everything he knew about paperweights. He did try and operate as a dealer and come to meetings afterwards, but he said he had to relearn about paperweights from his own books, and he hadn't done it very well. And really, if he put paperweights out on a table, you had to go and help him put away the expensive ones he'd put low prices on and so forth. And he only did that once or twice. But that really is the background to Bob's interest in paperweights, and in particular in the book, and then the sort of complex situation he found himself in, where having sold some pieces via Selman and directly to Bill Volkman, had come to the conclusion that they were not Bacchus. And as he says, they had to go in the chapter. So that rather muddies the waters. But Bob did, in producing this book, identify these various makers and put in the 23 pages of unknowns. In trying to determine whether some of these unknowns could be put into groups, tried to group them based on the similarity of the canes. I also looked at the glass density. You cannot identify a paperweight's maker by the glass density, but you can certainly sometimes say that seems to be way out of line with the others from this factory. So, I mean, are we sure about it? Didn't know which factories made them. And looking at all these matches between the unknowns and the Bacchus and the groups, I felt there needed to be a change to the book, but that was never going to happen. But as we go through the ones we're uncertain about, I'm going to refer to these other groups. Some of you will have read about them in articles I've written, but just briefly, there's half a dozen groups. You can match canes in them. They're just Old English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that's the second group. That's the third, which are slightly different from most of the Old English paperweights you see. That one's the size of a Clichy miniature. These Bob would call Bacchus, but there is no crossover of canes between classic Bacchus and these. There's a similar style, but just no crossover at all. Also, this head cane with the square bun doesn't appear in the Bacchus weights. In the Bacchus weights, it's a round bun and there's a flat base to the shoulders. It's from a different mold. Two more of that group, nice weights. And in fact, I think that one's in the Bergstrom Mahler and is labeled as a Bacchus, but I don't think it is. There's a group with these very fine, delicate canes. Again, don't know who made them. And then there's this group, which I would believe was Bacchus if I could find any cane that matched between the classic Bacchus weights and these. And what is unusual about these is you see this ivory-coloured cane in the centre of the, well, this is actually a bad basket of flowers, but there's this ivory-coloured cane, and I think it's probably that same ivory that's in the head. Anyway, we will perhaps refer to some of these groups when we're going through the chapter next. So that's me done for the moment.
Thank you so much, Alan. What we're going to do now is, if you're okay to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
And what we'll do now then is, thank you, Alan. That was really helpful to give the context from what you know about Bob Hall and to document that. And then also to give us a flavour of, I know you've distilled it into a couple of minutes, but basically 25 years of work and research into these different groups. So what we're going to do, and Brian, if you're able to help here, is just take a pause in case there's any comments or any questions just about what you've heard so far, and then we'll move into the positive Bacchus identification from the Bob Hall books. So I'll just wait and pause for a moment and see if anyone's got anything they'd like to say at this stage.
Yeah, just to say, if anyone does have a question or any comments, just take yourself off mute and introduce yourself. And yeah.
Tracy here in Toronto. Bob's sister, I believe, lived close to here. And Bob did visit us and went through our paperweight collection, and but it was after he was ill and he was having a lot of trouble, but he really did enjoy the weights. So it was just a real strong love for the weights.
Thank you, Tracy.
Hi, Victoria. It's Derek Carter. Alan mentioned a couple of times classic Bacchus. How does he define classic Bacchus?
I think by the group of weights that Victoria is going to describe next, to be honest. I mean, there's a sort of cohesion to them, a style, and it's just a loose term for that group of weights, really.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and further to that, when we go through the weights, there's some absolute classic Bacchus, and we'll explain a bit about what we mean by that. But there's also some which are slightly different designs, and there's sort of series of different designs. And so once the cane project is finished, then I think we will have the definitive list of classic Bacchus, but also canes which are used in different designs, which we'll take a look at. But hopefully we'll answer that a little bit more in the next slides, Derek, but really good question.
Thanks.
Okay, so over to me then, and Brian's going to helpfully share my slides again for me. So when we start to see the slides, in Bob Hall's book, there's a number of different paperweights. So from what we saw earlier is that of the 350 different weights that I've documented, then we have 192 of those concentric weights. So we've got 52 concentric weights, which we're going to go through now. And obviously aware of the time, I'm not necessarily going to go into each weight in lots of detail, but what we've done is we've, through the help which Ian Cummings did with me as well, he's done great helping me with the images of the weights, but also just with the cross-reference with the book. So in your own time with the recording, what you should be able to do is to then have a look in cross-reference this Zoom against your book and understand it a bit more. But following on from Derek's question and what Alan was saying around classic Bacchus, to me, when I look at a classic Bacchus weight, it's generally a very neat weight, quite packed together. And also it's got this sort of central cog or ruffle, you know, whatever you'd like to call them in the middle here. And you can see on this slide already, there's quite a lot of variety of those. And they're replicated throughout lots of the different paperweights. Some of them have got the pastel shades and then some of the brighter ones. And so on this particular slide, there's a few canes to note here, which in terms of some of the classic Bacchus canes that we were just talking about. So if you look at the top left one, there's the green row of canes. So that's sort of one which we see replicated quite a lot. And then also on the ones in the top middle, you can see on the outer row, there's a sort of red star in a yellow cane. And this gets picked up a lot as well in the weights. And then in the bottom middle, you can see there's a row of very yellow canes. And adjacent to that are these sort of red and white sort of complex canes as well. And then the other ones to note is this sort of green outer row on the bottom right, so of those. And then the blue and white one at the bottom left is a really beautiful weight. It's the only weight that's really is like that in terms of that colour palette. So that's a stunning one. So as we move into the next slide, then again, you can start to see some of these same canes appearing. This particular slide is really nice in that there's these beautiful pink canes that you can see in both the top left, the middle bottom, and then the outer row, very similar as well in that top row. And then also this gives you again an identification sort of the shades. So we've got some bolder patterns on that bottom left and the bottom right, and then some of the more pastel colours. So again, as we move through these slides, then you should start to notice some of the canes in common. Again, we can see those yellow ones in that top left. So moving to the next slide. I think these are some really strong, beautiful weights on here. This one's quite an interesting one in that we've got a different type of a classic Bacchus cane here. So if we look at the top left one, there's the sort of typical sort of row of the stars on the outer row with the white surrounding them. We can see the yellow again on that sort of row 2, as we call it. row 1, so the row just from the center. But then in the next row, we've got these quite spaced, and these are some of the more spaced weights that I've seen in terms of the canes. We've got these sort of red sort of white canes with the blue dots. And you can see that they also feature in the bottom right weight as well, which similarly has got those sort of yellow canes. One of the ones of the classic Bacchus canes that I particularly like on this one is that bottom left paperweight, where we've got these, I call them an eye, and when I do the cane project, they'll all get special names, but they're sort of these beautiful white canes with the yellow with the blue dot in the middle, and that appears in many of the Bacchus paperweights. Again, we can see a bit of variety in the center here, so we've got some of the sort of traditional cogs and ruffles, but then also some different designs. So moving to the next one. This is some really nice weights here. So on the bottom left weight, that's very, very similar to the heart-shaped one, which sold in Bonhams on that first slide that we saw. And again, you have to look quite closely at some of these weights because the rows are very much in common and the canes are the same. It's just they feature in different rows on the weights. Similarly, we can see the lovely greens and also the pinks on the top slide. And then I wanted to highlight again the reds and the whites in the bottom middle, but I wanted to highlight another set of canes here, which I consider sort of typical Bacchus, and they're really amazing. You can see, it depends on how big your screen is, but it's this set of orange canes on the two weights on the right-hand side. And in the center of them are multicolored little sort of complex canes within those. So we'll start to see some more of those as we move through the slides. The other one I particularly like here is it's quite rare actually, this sort of eye on the middle top one. There's not that many which feature that, but again, it's quite a strong visual cane, that one. So moving to the next one. Again, you can see the sort of variety here. We've got some really strong, bold colours on this slide. We've got some yellows and we've got the orange again. And then the blue one at the bottom is quite interesting because there's not that many blue canes. So this one's quite a striking one with that blue and yellow setups, particularly pleasing. So on the next slide, we can see here, I guess when we're talking about classic Bacchus canes, we can see the oranges, you can see those yellows, and you can see the pinks that we've talked about, and also the greens. And the bottom right one, there's a torsade on with that one as well. Another sort of classic, sort of one of the Bacchus centres is sometimes we see those ruffles or the cogs, but then there's a whole set of them. And one of the Bonhams paperweight that sold in 2023 has also got this. There's these amazing miniature close packs, which actually form the centre for which the other canes are featured around it. And they're incredibly detailed when you see them up close. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is, again, a slightly different style. So some of the weights, what we can see here are their sort of separate canes, which are surrounded in more of the white sort of texture that we associate with the sodden snows. So you can see there's some of the whites coming in here. But again, similarly, we see the greens that we've looked at before, the yellows that we've seen. And then I particularly was interested in showing this one because on the bottom right, Alan said that most of the paperweights are neat and tidy, which as you can see, most of them are. But this one, something went a bit badly wrong with this one. Its setup dropped. And one of the features of the Bacchus weights is because of the setup is quite precise. When you do start to look through them, you can notice a bit of a slipped cane here, or there's been a gap in the setup. And so they're not always, it was quite, there are some gaps within that, but that one's gone a bit badly wrong. So anyway, thank you. If we can go to the next one. This one's quite an interesting, sort of shows some of the variety of the concentrics. So you can see we've got the lovely pink canes on that bottom right. We've got the oranges, we've got the yellows. And it's worth noting that the shades of these, it's the same orange cane, but the one on the bottom left on the image you can see is a bit duller, whereas the one on the bottom middle is quite bright. So it is that same cane, it's just the variations of the photos of them. But the ones which are interesting on here are sort of the top two, really. The top left has got a sort of blue and a white cane in the middle, which is Quite rare in the Bacchus paperweights. There are some, but it's quite a different setup to some of what we've seen in very pastel shades. And then the middle top one, that's sort of more like some of the close packs that we see, but has been made into a concentric with a honeycomb cane right in the middle, which is again a sort of more of the classic Bacchus cane. So I think that one's just helpful because it just shows some of the variety still. So if we can move to the next one. This one, again, we can see lovely setup on the top right. So some of the greens that we saw in the white, quite aesthetically pleasing. Again, just that sort of 2-colour palette paperweight, right through to some of the bolds. And again, on that one on the left, you can see what I was saying about the setup maybe not being quite right. That row on this one has certainly not quite in a complete concentric ring. This is particularly interesting, these weights, because we can start to see the introduction of what I call sort of the Cambridge blue colours, and also a green central. We've seen a lot of reds and whites in the middle, but there are some green and there are some yellow, and also there's some faceted versions such as the one on the bottom right. So moving through, so we're onto some close packs now. So that was the 52 concentrics which are in the books. There's also some close packs, and what's quite interesting about the close pack of the Bacchus is in terms of those Bacchus classic canes, that's what I would say are really the canes on that sort of the left-hand row, sorry, the left-hand column, the middle bottom with the torsade, and then that right-hand faceted cane. So they're what I would tend to think some of the more classic Bacchus canes. But it's quite interesting, within the close packs, we also see this sort of second set of designs of some canes, which is where we start to see the sort of silhouetted picture canes coming in, really. So you can see there's an oak leaf, and also this is where the Queen's Head cane comes in, which is quite different. You can see, as Alan said earlier, it's got that flat base and then the round bun compared to the Queen Head silhouette that we saw. And all of 3 of those examples on that page all contain, you know, a Queen's Head silhouette or an acorn leaf. And so whilst we know that there are acorn leaves in concentric weights, there isn't a single Queen's Head cane in any concentric Bacchus paperweight that I've found so far. So if anyone's got one out there, please do send it through. The next slide is also Bacchus close packs. So these are the only ones within the book. And again, we can start to see a bit of variation here. So moving from some of the sort of classic Bacchus canes, which can be found in that very top right one, and then again, this sort of second set of designs in some of these other images. And it also shows you a bit of the variety of the texture and the colour palettes between them. Particularly that top left one is one where I'm really keen to do the cane matching, because that has a very different feel than some of those other ones. So we'll leave close packs now, and we move into what I think are some of the, to me, are some of the boldest and some of the, I suppose, the most iconic of the Bacchus paperweights that we see. So these are the patterns Millefiori, also Sodden Snow. You can see there's some which are really big and bold, again containing classic Bacchus canes, so more of the right-hand ones, and then the left-hand top one. And then there's also some which are a sort of close pack where they've got this green one. So again, each cane is covered by a green. It's sort of a Sodden Snow feel to it, but in this greeny colour. And there's a set of those. And again, in that one at the page 42, which is the second from the left on the bottom, you can see you've got that lovely yellow and blue particular eye cane in there as well. And then also there is a set of there's about 7 of them, which is the Sodden Snow types, which is that top row and the second from the right. Much daintier canes than others. But then again, they've got some of that classic, that sort of red with the sort of greeny brown in the middle as well. We see those in the weights. So there's some distinct sets of weights within Bacchus Sodden Snow types. So within carpet grounds, so there's 10 carpet grounds that we've managed to find in terms of unique weights. And it's also worth saying that throughout looking at 350 individual Bacchus weights, there isn't one at all the same. They're different, like I say, the rows might be inverted, very similar, but not the same at all. So these two carpet grounds appear in Bob Hall's book, quite sort of simple, quite pleasing, mostly whites. There is one which is red and white, but other than that, they are generally tend to be whites. And then moving into carpet grounds, we have mushrooms. So these are really interesting, I think, to me, having studied Bacchus paperweights a lot. So they're accepted as Bacchus paperweights. But what's really interesting with the mushrooms is that there's 24 of them, which we've documented, and only one of them has got the typical Bacchus canes that we have been talking about so far. So the mushrooms, and I need to do further cane research on this. So this is where I'm going to start with my next stage of my project. But we know that the mushrooms have all got similar canes between them. And looking at them all, there are lots of crossovers and the same canes. Some of them are just varying shades of tones from the photography. But what's confusing is that those canes, and like I say, I haven't done the full research, but I don't believe there are any crossover canes with other Bacchus paperweights. And I know Alan's going to touch on this a bit later. So I think that's all I'll say on Bacchus mushrooms at the moment. So that leaves some specials, and there's some truly amazing ones out there. So the top one is the one amazing paperweight from the front of the Bob Hall book. And then the second, or the right-hand one, is quite interesting. It's the only example of this sort of paperweight tuft or inner paperweight within the setup. And again, we can see some of the lovely pinks coming in at the bottom one. And then we also know there's some groups of encased, also some in baskets. The top left one will need to have just a bit more looking at in terms of the canes and that setup. But it does have the sort of yellow and blue one in there as well. So I think from the Bacchus paperweights, hopefully this has sort of given you a flavour of I suppose the range, the variety, but some of the features in common and some of those canes between them. What you can do is, like I say, afterwards, you can take this talk, watch it again, and then do that cross-reference with your book, and then spend some time just looking for these canes in common between the weights. But like I say, that should give a bit of a look and a feel of them. So if we can just take those slides down, and we'll pause there just in case there's any questions or any observations that anyone would like to make on those Bacchus weights, then if you can help us out, Brian. If people can come off mute again, if you have got anything, then do that.
I wanted to say I couldn't figure out how you were going to approach all of this, and I think your approach is excellent. This is amazingly well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It took some time and it took some thinking about, but it's quite, there's quite a lot to try to put in there. And like I say, thank you to Ian Cummings again for helping with the clarity of those paperweights and the imagery. If you look in the book, some of them, are quite different in the photos. So the fact that we've been able to trace some of these weights again, and also some of the photographers, that's really good.
So what you're saying is the pictures are not the pictures in the book. They're new pictures that you've taken of these same weights. Is that correct?
A bit of a mix of both, Alan. So what we've managed to do is, through documenting the 350 different weights, then we've been able to build up provenance information on each weight. So some of them, for example, have never been seen before, like the two I've bought. The only documented history on them are the ones that the ones through the sale, my photographs Brian took, whereas others have changed hands several times. And so through the project, we've been seeing lots of the same weights coming up over and over again. And so a mix of images are those from either private collections who've shared their images, from auction catalogues who've also given permission for sharing them. And then also some of the images will have the full copyright when they go on the website. So the website will have as many of the 350 as I've got allowed to have permission to be able to, I suppose, use them on the website, I guess.
Just to say, Alan, if you're looking in the book, you won't always find the same image in the book as on the slideshow, because some of these photos Vic has managed to, and Ian has managed to source better versions of those images. So just in case you're looking for the identical image, you may not find it in all cases. Yeah.
No,
Well,
I was.
can I just point something out here? Most of or a large percentage of the weights in the book were from the Falkman collection. And the Falkman collection was dispersed, I think it was in early 2000s, not long after the book was actually published. I think the book was published in 98. And I think it was 2000, end of 2000, 2001, the Falkman collection was dispersed and sold off, mainly by Nancy Alfano in Chicago. And that was when Bernd, my partner at the time, had the chance to photograph a lot of the weights that, for instance, we've seen in the slideshow this evening.
So thanks for that clarification. I couldn't even see the colors, and I was just wondering how you did the comparison, because I was just staring at the book as you were going through it, and this was much more useful, and I really appreciate the fact that you put in the time, all of you, to do this research and to get better pictures.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
It'll help a lot.
Like Ian says, we were really fortunate that Bernd had taken so many photographs of the weights, and then also other people have shared them. And so what's been really interesting is that Ian's also managed to find a number of black and white catalogues as well. And so what's been particularly exciting is when we've got this images of all these black and white paperweights, and then suddenly we've found a colour image of it. And so that happens very rarely. But if anyone's got any old black and white catalogues, if you don't want to go through them or you're not sure if it's a Bacchus or not, please do send me images, because there will be some from these early catalogues that we maybe haven't documented. And so it's just trying to get the best image that we can and get the right permissions and copyright of them, so that we can, on the website, use those, and then I suppose help bring it into some of the colours a bit better.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we'll do then is we'll pass on to Alan, if that's okay to you, Alan, who then can go through some of the queries in the book that we have.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, I'm trying to get it to bring up my.
I'm starting to see that now, Alan, and
Yeah, fine.
Perfect.
Okay, so from current slide, and we should be in business. Okay, can everyone see that now?
Yep, thank you, Alan. That's clear.
Yeah, fine. Okay, what we've done is taken pictures of the pages in the book where there are paperweights we're uncertain about, let's put it that way, or at least uncertain and think they may belong to other groups. And so you see here on page 18, Bob has illustrated a couple of paperweights. You can actually match canes between the two of them. One he's called an early one, one's he's called a later one, but none of the canes in those weights match any of those classic ones which Victoria showed. And what they do match, in fact, is the group that I showed and I've called Old English 4. There's quite a lot of these weights. There's just nothing that matches with any of the classic Bacchus weights. So I think these do not belong in the Bacchus chapter myself. Next ones are on page 19, where we have this horrible mess, is the technical description, I think, which he calls an early Bacchus. And then another one here with head silhouettes. But this is where he's fallen into his trap of saying anything with a head silhouette's a Bacchus, because these are very different silhouettes. I have actually seen them in weights which I think are Richardson. There was a bottle base with one of those at its centre, and the rest of it was obviously Richardson. So I don't think those are Bacchus heads, and nor are these little blobs. So I would class both of those as just from an unknown maker. that's the base of them. I mean, they're treated in the same way in general, that the canes are pulled underneath, but that is not something specific to Bacchus. You can find that in Walsh Paperweights, Richardson, various unknowns. Then we have an interesting one here, which has got these head silhouettes. On the other hand, none of the other canes look particularly like the ones found in the classic Bacchus weights. It is certainly the head silhouette that appears in the Bacchus weights, but what we don't know is exactly where that mold came from. There were lots of factory closures, their possessions were sold off. Bacchus may have even bought that in. So it's all a bit uncertain, that one. And again, I would class that as unknown. These canes do not appear in Bacchus.
I think actually, Alan, that weight is in the Bergstrom Mahler Museum.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 in there which are labelled Bacchus, and which I last time I was there, I was discussing it with Casey and saying, I'm not convinced by these, This one here, I have got several weights with that cane in the centre, and they are not Bacchus weights. They are the ones that I have called OE1. Oh, sorry, let me just go back. This is an interesting weight. It's got some very nice complex canes, but again, these just do not look like the ones you find in the classic Bacchus weights. I think that for the moment falls into the unknown category. Here we've got a beautiful square bun cane. Not Bacchus, I'm afraid. I think that belongs in the group I call OE1. When I was at Bob's and measuring the density of weights, this is one of the ones he had actually got at the house. It's a very distorted cane in the middle there, but I think that is the square bun and the arch to the shoulders. And these canes look very like those in the OE4 group. So I don't think that's Bacchus. It's a very unusual piece. Problem with densities is that it could belong to either group. That the canes do not match Bacchus, but they do match the OE1 group. I think we're happy that's the perfectly typical classic Bacchus. You notice the cane slippage here. I mean, that's what happens if the setup isn't tight when they pick it up. They can make it tight by sticking in clear glass rod, or else by putting in a larger or smaller or different cane, which I think is what leads to some of these rogue canes that Bob likes spotting. But it's not just Bacchus who did that. You can find the same in St. Louis, for example. They had the problem of slippage and cured it by putting in other canes. This, I suspect, is actually a Gillinder weight, because none of these canes look like the ones you find in the classic Bacchus. They do look the style of Gillinder, and I think that's the same square bun cane that William Gillinder had, and which you can find in some of his weights, and you can find in the Toledo Museum. That's an interesting piece. One point at the Broadfield House Museum, I've shown that. Again, this is this square bun and the arched shoulders. That is a very distinctive cane, and it's quite like the ones that I've called OE4. I don't think it's Bacchus. None of these canes really match the Bacchus canes. Again, we've got what's called a miniature. Well, if it was the first miniature we'd have seen, I think. Notice the little Queen's head there, a bigger one there. There again, the square bun cane. There's another little one in these, absolutely tiny. That's a very distinctive cane as well. It belongs to that group. if there was any crossover between that group and Bacchus, you might say, oh, well, it was really made at maybe a later point in their history, but there just isn't any crossover in probably 100 weights. That is a very unusual piece. I mean, Bob describes it as one of the rarest of Bacchus paperweights. I mean, I think I would agree that it's rare. The centre cane here does resemble Bacchus. That could be from Bacchus, it could be from various other people. But it's pretty unusual. I mean, I would leave it in the unknown category, but if somebody could convince me it was Bacchus, I'd go along with it. Now, Victoria touched on this group with this beautiful torsades and very nicely made weights. I think there's probably only 2 colours of torsade. You see 3 or 4 apparently, but I think that's just different colour casts on images. I think there's a slightly magenta version of red, and then there is this blue and white one. Very nicely made, but it's a sort of standard type of cane, this, that appears in various groups. And none of these say to me, these are specifically Bacchus canes. So, I mean, again, I would call all those mushrooms unknown rather than Bacchus. This is a very typical weight belonging to one of the groups I've identified, as are canes like that. And that's this OE4 group. It's quite a large group. Now, this is an interesting one. It's just nothing like any of the classic Bacchus. I think extraordinary and possibly unique is obviously correct. However, rather than saying, well, it's nothing to do with Bacchus, I think it probably is, because Bacchus exhibited at the Great Exhibition in 1851. No paperweights. It was just their vases, decanters, this kind of thing. And that's from the Art Journal. That's a drawing. And this vase, big vase in the middle, it says, the lozenge-shaped, a deep ruby colour, cased with white, wreaths of green ivy. If you try and colour it in, it's going to be something like that. And if you stick that alongside the weight, I could well believe that this weight was made possibly from a piece of broken vase that somebody played around doing some more cameo-style cutting on. Or maybe it was just a bit of an experiment. But I think that is one piece you could say virtually certainly was made by Bacchus, actually, or at least the inner piece. Here we've got some heads, but none of the rest of the canes match any of those in the classic Bacchus. The heads could be the same one Bacchus uses, although when you see them in the Bacchus weights, the close packs, I refer to them as the Mary Poppins head because that's the silhouette. These could be the OE1 group, the canes are similar, but the head would have to be quite a distortion of the square bun cane, but I mean, it is so distorted in these that you can't really tell. Similarly here, that's a very distorted head, hard to say. But the rest of the... Sorry? Your question? Oh. These don't really match any of the classic Bacchus canes. This one's a bit like some of them. So I'd be uncertain on that. There's another of these mushrooms, which I don't... these torsade weights, which I don't think are. Some of these are close to OE1, so I suspect that's a square bun cane that's distorted, but it is so distorted it's hard to tell. Another of these nice torsade weights, but same description applies. Back in this unknown, I think there's, I can't remember how many Victoria said she got, a couple of dozen maybe. All very nicely made, all obviously from the same factory, but question mark, which factory? Then we have this strange beast, which I'm guessing Bob sold to Bill Volkman as a Bacchus, but I don't know why, to be honest. It's an interesting weight, but I see nothing in it that says to me this is a Bacchus. Then we have this one here. Well, I've got several weights which have these canes in, and they're not Bacchus weights. They're this group I would call OE6. If I could find one that was this OE6 group and had Bacchus canes in, I'd be delighted, because it would settle where these few OE6 weights come from. But they are similar in style, but they are distinct. There is no crossover, no Bacchus canes in these, none of these canes in Bacchus. So I think it's a different factory. Okay, let me just go back. That was all I wanted to say about going through those. There's obviously a lot of sort of personal opinion, and the reasoning is quite often just we cannot see any classic Bacchus canes there. But equally, none of the canes in these appear in the classic Bacchus weights. So I think they're the product of different factories. Anyway, I'll leave that there, and happy to try and answer questions.
Thank you so much, Alan. Are you happy to stop sharing your screen? On it. So,
Done.
Yeah, thank you so much. Obviously, we've benefited from all of your research from over that 25 years to help us. And I think, as Alan was saying, having studied these, these weights, they're all really beautiful, apart from the couple of those messy ones. But no, they're all really beautiful. But it's the fact that we don't have the crossover canes, which make it hard to sort of say that they're of the same group or not. So I'm aware we've given you quite a lot of information in terms of the sort of bombarding with the photos and the images. And so that's what Alan and I wanted to share with you this evening. Is there anything else or any comments or any questions or anything that you've seen or heard or you'd like to talk about in a bit more detail? And we can always get the slides up again if there was a particular one. But yeah, over to you now, really.
Just whilst people are coming off mute, I'm going to jump in with a question. Alan, that unique overlay that you felt could be Bacchus with the ivy and so on.
Oh, yes.
Are there many overlays in Old English weights? Or is that in itself quite a rarity, let alone for it to be Bacchus?
I think I only know of one other overlay.
Huh.
There's Vanessa Simcox has got one that belongs to one of the groups I identified. I think it's the one I call OE5. I think it's a faceted blue overlay.
Wow.
But I think that's the only other one I've seen.
Wow, so yeah, even the overlay is rare, let alone it may even be Bacchus. Yeah, strange.
I mean, I'm pretty convinced that ivy leaf thing will have come from the Bacchus factory, whether they intended to make a paperweight, whether somebody was just learning to cut through the layers of glass to make the ivy leaves, and then the piece that was left, somebody made into a paperweight, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, well, thank you.
So I just have one question, and that is that there's often, coming from the United States, this is Alan Port speaking, coming from the United States, we often get confusion between Gillinder and Old English. I'll leave it at that. I won't say necessarily Bacchus. And were you tempted at any point? You don't create a Gillinder-like category in your classifications. Were you tempted to do that, Alan? Because that.
Yeah, I don't really see. The simpler Gillinder canes are like the simpler canes of any other factory. Gillinder put them together very nicely to make his paperweights. But you don't see anything more complex, and you don't see any Old English paperweights that are just made from those, sort of cog canes that give you the Gillinder impression. I'm sort of 99% convinced that Gillinder was never anywhere near Bacchus. He worked in Birmingham, true. He worked for one of the glass factories. I have my own theory as to why he had that square bun cane that he used, and that was that he worked at the factory in Birmingham that had it and was probably given it as a gift to take with him.
Okay.
You know, but I think the implication of that would be that he might have had a hand in making some of the paperweights that I've got, which do have those Queen's Head canes in. I don't know whether I've got one to hand here, but no, I've not got one. Yeah. Can you, I don't know if you can see that.
Yes.
That has got some relatively simple cog canes in, as well as some complex ones, and it's got that same Queen's Head that Gillinder used. And like several others I've got, it has got a horrific annealing crack. I've seen others come up on eBay from that factory. They've got the Queen's Head cane in that Gillinder used, and they've got horrible annealing cracks. Not many seem to have survived uncracked. My suggestion is that, in fact, William Gillinder was brought into work in that factory for his expertise on glass to try and overcome this annealing issue they had. And that's why he ended up with some of that head cane. But, you know, you can speculate, that's all I would say. Okay, you can speculate it might even have been the Victoria Glassworks, which James Stephens converted to a crystal factory in 1849. He wouldn't have got things right first time. You know, things might have gone wrong. He got Gillinder in to help.
I think we have a question from Gian Luigi. You're muted, Gian. Sorry, Gian, you're still muted. You need to come off mute. Ah, there you go.
Sorry. I would like to ask to Alan if in a sort of way the British producer were in contact with the European producer, with the European production, like French or Venetians or Bohemian ones, because I don't see any influence of these European production in their products. And these are very interesting aspects.
Yeah. There was contact between the British makers and French and Bohemian. I mean, William Gillinder, when he was in Birmingham, visited Bohemia and Silesia and the factories there. And of course, Islington, the Islington Glassworks in Birmingham, brought in French workers as strike breakers. And you see the influence of, some of them are supposed to have been from Bacchus, and you see the influence of that in the Islington Paperweights. I don't know if you're familiar with Islington Paperweights. You know what they look like?
I don't remember them so well.
You see that?
Yes, correct.
You see the blue canes? They look like Bacchus.
The blue ones, yes.
The blue honeycomb. But that's made at the Islington Glassworks in Birmingham.
So there were exchange.
Yeah, but by French workers, I think, yes.
Yeah.
And so there was contact between them. But they maintained their own style in England, I think.
Thanks, Alan.
I just wanted to come in. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for joining us, Gian Luigi. It's the first time you've joined us online, so thank you for that. In terms of the questions about Gillinder, Bacchus, Old English Paperweights, when I set off writing my brief for my current project, I did think that at some point I might decide to do a Gillinder catalogue at some point as well. So that will be quite a long time off, but I definitely think it'd be really interesting to somehow get collating all of the different Old English paperweights out there in people's collections, because the more paperweights we have and the more we can look at and try and see these crossovers, the more we're going to learn between them. So watch this space. There may be some future projects happening some way down in a few years' time, or if anyone else has got particular inquisitive research minds, if you're after a project, maybe this is the one. Brilliant. I'll pause there. I don't know if anyone else has got any questions, comments, or anything from what you've heard tonight you'd like to.
Can I just ask something, Victoria, or rather to Alan as well? The image of Queen Victoria changed throughout her reign. And so when you look, for example, at the National Portrait Gallery, of the silhouette image of her in, say, 1840, 1860, it changes in its appearance. I was wondering whether these differences in the Queen's silhouette are related to the way in which she changed over time. Silhouettes were a very fashionable way of portraying the Queen, you know, starting from coins onto black and white scissor cutouts. And I was just having a look while Alan was talking at the National Portrait Gallery image from about 1855. And it pretty much nails on several of the images that we've seen in paperweights. And I was just wondering if that was an interesting avenue to date the sort of paperweights the one's looking at.
I think that the whoever made the mould, and that was probably within the sort of blacksmith shop or foundry of the glass factory, had a
newspaper cutout.
They just reached in their pocket and they got out a penny. And on the back of that was the young Queen Victoria. And unfortunately, you can get that penny for a long period of time. You know, I don't think they'd have gone for a portrait of her in a gallery. I think they might have seen the stamp, you know, the 1837 stamp.
I think the influence of Anthony Trollope cannot be underestimated. That is pretty true. I also think that the development of newspapers and literacy, you know, if you just look at the banners on the Thunderer over time, you know, and the way in which Victoria was portrayed, it's quite interesting looking at the shape of the bun as it changes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's possible.
I think, yeah, really interesting. And I'm definitely going to go off and have a look at those images that you've talked about. One of the things that when I get to the cane project that I'd like to do is to try to get every single different Queen Victoria silhouette heads cane from the weights and put them all side by side. And some of them obviously, you know, change through the process. But yeah, just have a complete set of them. Because there's not that many of them. But yeah, a really interesting theory. So yeah, definitely I'll be following that up, Susan.
What you can do, Victoria, where you've got distorted ones, is use something like Photoshop to squeeze them back to circular.
Thank you, Alan. You've just
what they originally looked like.
Thanks, Alan. You just added another job to my long list of technical jobs. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay. Well, that sounds as though we've managed to, hopefully share some knowledge from, you know, the studies that we've both been doing, and then also add our takes to help people. I guess, you know, it's such a difficult subject, and, you know, we see these weights come up, and, you know, if we can help share any information so that people are either looking out, if you know, there's that one that pops up and you're thinking, oh, there might be something in this, it might have an interesting cane, is it Bacchus, is it not Bacchus? Please do, you know, share it just in case it is, or we can help with that identification, because the more examples that we know, whether they help support the different groups that Alan's looking at, whether, you know, we can help add any more information, would be fantastic. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining tonight. It's been really, really popular tonight. We've had lots of people joining from all over the world. And also we have had some new people who haven't joined Zooms before. So that's really good. Brian's just going to now share the slides. Oh, sorry, did somebody want to come in, Mathanwi? No? If you're okay to share,
sorry,
Brian.
Sorry, we just had a visitor.
Ah, okay.
Well, thanks. This has been very stimulating, if nothing else. It gives us a new way to look at some of our mystery weights, and I know that the Simmons book and also Alan's many writings have helped us to sort out some of the other factories, like Arceus, obviously, and Richardson, and some Wash. But this is really making us focus on the earlier British factories, and they're so rare that, especially in the United States, they're incredibly rare that it's really difficult to come up with any identification. But this gives us some new clues on how to look at these weights. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Alan. One of the things where, because I quite like my nerdy facts and things, one of the information things I've got is, because of the work that Ian and myself have been doing to collate the known provenance in these ways, I want to plot them all on a map and see how many of them, where are they? There's also some which have turned up in incredible places as well. So when we think about, that they were made in England, they've traveled, some of them have traveled back and forth across the Atlantic. Some of them have ended up in places you wouldn't even think about. So it's really interesting, that side of it. And so we can start to see furthest from home. Most times they've crossed, and so it's really interesting. I'll come up with some facts at some points. So if anyone has got, so we've covered obviously the Bob Hall book tonight and started to give an idea of introduction into identification. If anyone would like to know any more Bacchus related things, then I'm sure Alan and we can come together and help put on another talk like this in the future, or when we've got something new to share, or some of the interesting stories behind them. I know that there's two paperweights which Ian Cummings will be able to help me out here, because I can't remember off the top of my head, but basically there's been two paperweights that we know that have stayed with each other for decades and decades and decades. So there's some quite nice little stories around some of the discoveries, as well as just the patterns of them. So just want to thank Alan tremendously for his prep on all the slides, and then also sharing his knowledge. Also, like I say, to Ian for all of his work on the photos, the imagery, the provenance, and then also thank you to Bernd for all the photos in the storage, and also for the collectors who've also helped us with this to help make those images, bring them up to date. So before we move on to PCC thing, I'll just take a pause in case there's any other final Bacchus related comments, and then if not, we'll ask Brian to share the slides for PCC stuff.
Can I just point something out? The details of Alan's various groups can be found on the in the old newsletters, which are now on the PCC website. Yeah. You will be getting a new password soon to be able to get into the website. But there you can certainly find pictures of Alan's various groups and pictures of the canes that are in those groups.
Thank you, Ian.
Can I just ask one thing, Victoria? Can you include in your work some information on the cutting that you find sometimes on Bacchus paperweights? The belief is that was done afterwards because of repairing damage, but there does seem to be some recurring themes in the types of cutting that appear, whether that's just something which is typical of the period or a particular restorer. But just in case there were some paperweights made with cuttings from the factory side.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that I was going to say, I think that Ivy one might be original.
Yeah, we have two weights that have identical faceting that are Bacchus, whether you can see them or not. And we thought because of that the faceting was probably original.
Can I ask, Rick, is that 6 circles over 9?
Let me count them. Yep, 6 for sure. And then
yes.
Yeah, and then this one also has another, how many at the bottom? There's like 3 rows of faceting. There's
Yeah.
Another 9.
Another
I'll
9.
just say that I asked particularly about 6 over 9 because I've had at one time a Bacchus which had 6 over 9.
This is 6. This is
6 at the top,
6, 9,
next row
9.
was 9. So there's some similarity in those cuttings. And it might just be a particular person, but when you get that similarity, you say, okay,
yeah,
it could be back at the factory.
Yeah, makes
I think
sense.
So what we've managed to do is to get the faceted weights. So I've got within the catalogue raisonné, we've got sections of faceted weights and non-faceted weights. So that's definitely something which we can look at, whether we've mainly got top-down images, so we can see if we can source the other images as well. So that's definitely an interesting one to look at. What I do know though is we've got an example of just got to remind myself what it is. So it's a close pack, and we've got it faceted and unfaceted. So we found out when the damage has occurred from between the 2 different sales that happened. So yeah, that's a really good one because we know that's not an original facet, so we can help compare that. So yeah, I'll take that away and add that to our research list.
We also have an unfaceted one, which seems to be just slightly smaller than the 2 faceted ones. They just seem to be heavier and just slightly larger to incorporate that faceting.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll have to make a note of that. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, whether the faceted ones are slightly bigger or whether other ones have lost some size due to being repolished.
You can't repolish too much, though, before you cut into the basket of canes.
Yeah.
Can I ask one question?
Okay. Brian, was there something you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, well, it's more of a general comment. Was to say thanks very much to Alan. I know it's a difficult subject, I guess, to sort of look at someone else's book like this and to critically go through it and reassess what has become almost fact, right? But particularly for a new collector like myself, and maybe Vic less so because she's now deep into Bacchus, but particularly it definitely makes me realize, as we sort of reminds me to not always believe what I read in the books just because it's in a printed book. And I think it's easy to fall into the trap of reading a book and thinking, well, it's published and therefore it's correct. And yes, things get out of date, but it was quite startling how many errors, let's call them errors, are in this book. And particularly for Bacchus weights, when, the financial consequences of buying one and getting it wrong for someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of money to buy a weight and splashes out and buys a special weight. So I think, although it was a difficult subject for you to tackle, I think you appreciate us newbies. I think you probably helped a few of us maybe make less mistakes in the future, maybe. So thank you. Yeah, thanks, Alan.
You're welcome.
Thanks for that. So, Brian, if you can share this couple of last slides again, please. So this is just a reminder. So Paperweight Collector Circle, we've been doing quite a lot of new things in the last year. One of them is this tremendous, really big Magnum Damon McNaught weight, which we bought on behalf of the club for the sole purpose not sole purpose, 2 purposes. One, support Damon the artist, but 2, introduce a new sort of fun member benefit. So this is going to be drawn at the AGM, which is on the 23rd of February. Alan, we have posting again, is giving a talk on the Chinese white paperweights. So hopefully see some of you there. And we are going to try and record the event for those of you we know who can't make it for valid reasons like being a long way away overseas. So yeah, raffle tickets are still on sale. We will probably stop sort of the day before for that. So it's just a reminder on that. And then the final slide, please, Brian. So we know we've got some non-members on the call today. We've got sort of, I suppose, what we've been doing as being a really active club. We've done a huge, tremendous number of online talks last year, plus also meeting. We had some great American artists come. We also had Damon came to us in June, and we had a great meeting. So we're quite active in terms of on the online space. We've also got 3 high quality newsletters. So these are like mini PCA style 20-page newsletters that Derek, Ian and Norman, who are all on our call tonight, put lots of time and effort into, really informative and also very interesting just to share either auction news, specific items and detailed about paperweights, mystery weights, all sorts of things. Ian gave us, has been sort of alluded to it earlier, we also have a members area where we have over 700 articles online. Alan talked about the papers that he's written. Many of those can be found by searching the topic on there. So if you put in Old English and the passwords, it will bring you up lots and lots of different articles that you can spend more time reading about. So yeah, so it's just to let you know that, you know, we are very keen for people to join the club, and that helps us to do talks like this. So I think that is all I would like to do, other than say a final thank you to Alan. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you to my...
Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, thank you to Ian Cummings, who's helped me enormously with all sorts of things, from queries to images to coming back and sorting out some of the provenance for me as well. So thank you, Ian, and also obviously for the images. Also, thank you to all the collectors. So many collectors have shared the paperweights from in their collection, which they think are Bacchus or aren't Bacchus. And that's really helped us to get this picture of the 350 which are documented. And yeah, thank you, Brian, again for your wizardry to help make the technical aspects of this Zoom go smoothly. So I hope you've all enjoyed that and look forward to seeing you again soon. And like I say, we'll make the link available so that you can watch it in your own time, cross-reference the book, and then maybe draw in it, highlight it, tick it, see what you own think. If you have different conclusions from your own thoughts, then do let us know. Alan and I are always very keen to hear thoughts like that. So yeah, thank you everyone, and good night.
And thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.